From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Special welcome to friends of Marlene's who are here. We're pleased to have you here. Welcome to the Center for the Books and Beyond Author Lecture Program. The Center for the Book itself was created in 1977 by Daniel Boorstin when he was Librarian of Congress. And his idea was the Library of Congress should be doing more to reach out to the general public to promote books and reading, to which menu we have added literacy promotion, library promotion, and basic public outreach on behalf of books and reading and learning. And through the years, we have developed state networks. Each state has an official affiliate, which works with the state itself to promote what turns out to be, in many ways, really working with author promotion in that particular state. And each state, plus the Virgin Islands, and we hope someday the other territories that participate in the Pavilion of the States of the National Book Festival, which is another major area of our interest. But each state is here, and a number of those states back in their own areas sponsor book festivals and have author events and get the writers of that, give the writers of the state great support. In Maryland, it started with the Howard County Library, but also now is one of 10 state centers anchored and supported by the Humanities Councils. So it's the Maryland Humanities Councils. Initially, when we started this, and I was the founding director and had the pleasure of going to all of the states trying to develop this wonderful idea, I did approach Enoch Pratt Public Library. It was before the present librarian was there. And it was a period of transition, and I learned a lot about Maryland. I learned about each state. If there's only going to be one official Library of Congress affiliate in reading and promotion, it becomes sort of competitive in one sense, and that is you learn quickly that in some states, such as Maryland, while Enoch Pratt would have been a natural, and there's no particular state government agency called a state library, a lot of people felt that it really was one more thing in Baltimore, and it really should find a way to reach out as each state needed to do. So it was natural that in the way that we started at Howard County and then we ended up in Baltimore, but it was with the statewide Humanities Council. So that's kind of our story there. We also have literacy and reading promotion nonprofit organizational partners, and I've mentioned the book festival, but we here at the Library of Congress sponsor this particular series, which is aimed at celebrating new books. I don't quite have the final edition yet to show up for the camera. We film all of these for the Library of Congress website. But books that have been published by authors who have made good use of the Library of Congress's collections or other collections. And it's fun for us to be able to show the result of research and the result of libraries, and to do so through promoting books and the sales of books. And today's program, after our speaker finishes a talk of around 40 minutes or so, we'll have a chance for question and answers, and then a book sales and book signing at the Library of Congress discount of 10% in the foyer. We are filming this, as I've mentioned, for our website, for the library's website, and for the Books and Beyond portion of that. And this series actually started in 1996, and we now are reaching around the 350 mark in terms of presentations. So through those websites, and also through the website presentations for the National Book Festival, which started thanks to Laura Bush asking, as First Lady, asking the Library of Congress to form the partnership, has resulted in several hundred more web author presentations on the Library of Congress website. So I urge you to take a look at that website to get a sense of what's happening in literature and writing today, especially maybe in some ways in biography and nonfiction, which is kind of the specialty in some ways of the Books and Beyond series, only because another part of the Center for the Book is the Poetry and Literature program, which has a very active program in poetry and fiction. And finally, a new section is new center, a mini center, which we opened in 2009, was the Library of Congress's first Young Readers Center. So we have the first place at the Library of Congress really aimed at the reading interests of kids 16 and under, who are welcome to this beautiful suite of rooms in the Jefferson Building, as long as they are accompanied by an adult, which is an interesting way of getting to the subject of family literacy. So for us, the Books and Beyond and the Young Readers program are extremely important. Today, as you know, we have a special presentation by a Maryland resident, and this is and I'm going to let Marlene, excuse me, I called you Marilyn, Marlene talk about her book, but it does have this wonderful subtitle that lays it all out for us. So Marlene's book is Fair Labor Lawyer, The Remarkable Life of a New Deal Attorney and Supreme Court Advocate, Bessie Margolin. It is published by Louisiana State University Press, which is a press we have actually worked with before Marlene in a couple of occasions. And as we said in our publicity, but you will learn in greater detail, during her life, Bessie shaped modern American labor policy as a Supreme Court advocate while creating a place for female lawyers in the nation's highest courts. And you will learn about some of the obstacles that she overcame during the talk. And as I said earlier, we'll have a chance to ask questions of Marlene and to have a book signing afterwards. Marlene Trestman is a former special assistant to the Maryland Attorney General, where she started her 30-year legal career in 1982. She has taught law at Loyola, Loyola University at Maryland's Selinger School of Business and Management, where she earned her MBA. A former trustee of Goucher College, she currently serves on the board of Goucher's Prison Education Partnership. A New Orleans native, Marlene has had a personal relationship with Bessie Margolin that will grew from common childhood experiences, and I have a feeling we are going to learn something about that immediately. Let's join me in welcoming Marlene Trestman.
Thank you, John, for that nice introduction, and it's really an honor to be here at the Library of Congress. I want to thank each of you for taking time to come and learn something about Bessie Margolin. Through a life that spanned the 20th century, Bessie Margolin contributed to 3 major episodes of modern American history. She defended the constitutionality of the New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority. She drafted rules for the Nazi war crimes trials. And for more than 3 decades, she championed the Fair Labor Standards Act, ultimately including the Equal Pay Act. Entrusted with the Labor Department's litigation, Margolin presented 24 arguments at the Supreme Court, one of only 3 women to do so in the 20th century, and prevailed in 21 of them. For 20 years, solicitors general assigned those Supreme Court arguments to her, and she was the last Labor Department lawyer to receive that distinction. She began her legal career in 1930, when only 2% of America's lawyers were women. She served in the federal government under 6 presidents, from FDR to Nixon, and 9 labor secretaries, beginning with Francis Perkins. She received every award the Labor Department offered, and by 1963 was promoted to associate solicitor, the department's top non-political legal position. In short, Before there was a notorious RBG, there was an audacious Bessie Margolin. After retiring in 1972, however, Margolin seemed to fade from the public record. It's not hard to understand why she deserves to be rescued from obscurity, but I'd like to explain how I came to take on that task. In the fall of 1974, I was a freshman at Goucher College, far from my home in New Orleans. My high school guidance counselor had written Margolin, a distinguished alumna from our class of 1925 of the Isidore Newman School, the letter of introduction shown here. Through college, law school, and into my legal career, I got to know Bessie Margolin. She was the first female lawyer I ever met, and we were connected by common childhood experiences. Bessie and I were both wards of the same Southern Jewish Children's Welfare Agency, which educated us at Isidore Newman School, a half-century apart. Bessie Margolin personified excellence in the law and in public service at a time when women attorneys were discouraged, if not outright prevented, from pursuing opportunities available to men. While protecting the rights of millions of American workers, she also advanced the careers of countless government lawyers and employees, many of whom sought out her prestigious and demanding tutelage. The late Simon Soboleff, who was chief judge of both Maryland's Court of Appeals and the Federal Fourth Circuit, and a former Solicitor General, offered only 2 suggestions for lawyers who sought a federal appellate practice. They should work in either the office of the Solicitor General, naturally, or in the office of Bessie Margolin. I'd like to share her journey from beneficiary of social justice to its powerful advocate, and along the way I'll offer just a few examples of the wonderful resources here at the Library of Congress that enabled me to understand her journey, resources that preserve the needles of her otherwise undocumented life amid the archival haystacks of far more celebrated individuals. Bessie was born in 1909 in Brooklyn, New York, the first American-born child of Russian Jewish immigrants. From there, to escape New York's tough and crowded conditions, Bessie's family made its way to Memphis, Tennessee. About a year after giving birth to a 3rd child, Bessie's mother died, leaving Bessie's father alone to care for 3 very young children. The Margolins' plight attracted the attention of a Memphis rabbi who petitioned the Jewish Orphans' Home in New Orleans to accept the children as so-called half-orphans. In 1913, the orphanage admitted Bessie, age 4, and her siblings. Proclaimed a magnificent monument to Hebrew benevolence, the home, as it was known, sat prominently on gracious St. Charles Avenue near the stately mansions of New Orleans' most prosperous citizens. It was both a stunning contrast to the humble origins of its young residents and an inspiring symbol of what each child could, and many of them did, achieve. In the home, Bessie grew up with more than 150 other orphans and half-orphans from throughout the Deep South. Its trustees, however, were not content to provide mere subsistence to its charges. Instead, the home groomed Bessie as an all-American girl who shed honor on the local Jewish community and reflected the values and culture of her prosperous benefactors. In addition to a religious education in Reform Judaism that preached social justice, the home provided Bessie a robust secular education at the Isidore Newman Manual Training School, where the cutting-edge curriculum emphasized manual skills in home economics and woodworking, as well as rigorous academics. The home built this unique school to educate its wards, first and foremost, but also admitted New Orleans children of all religions whose parents paid tuition. Newman quickly became what it remains today, one of the South's finest colleges and finest college prep schools. Bessie excelled in every subject. She graduated from Newman in 1925 as a 16-year-old leader who was comfortable in a co-ed setting, competing, succeeding, and winning respect. Besides leading the debate club and the Girls' Student Council, Bessie was valedictorian and won a coveted scholarship to Newcomb College, Tulane University's coordinate college for women. Bessie spent 2 years at Newcomb, ranking among top 10 in her class, but the audacious Bessie wanted more. She decided to attend law school, something no other girl from the home had ever done. As Tulane Law School's only woman at the time, Bessie felt isolated and self-conscious. But she and her male classmates soon adjusted to each other. When a professor assigned a torts case involving an accident in a men's bathroom, no one wanted to recite the facts of the case because they were embarrassed to use the word toilet in mixed company. When one poor fellow in the class finally blurted out washroom, they all sighed with relief. In June 1930, at age 21, Bessie completed her liberal arts and her law studies with honors in only 5 years. She graduated second in her law school class and was civil law editor of the Law Review. Tulane Law School's Dean Rufus Harris urged Yale Law School's Dean Charles Clark to hire Bessie or award her a fellowship for graduate studies. Clark found Bessie worthy of a job but refused to consider her for a fellowship because he did not want to encourage her to pursue a career teaching law that simply did not exist for a woman. Harris assured Clark that Bessie was, in his words, a level-headed girl who knew some things in this world must be taken as they are, or so he thought. With her fate determined by the two deans, Bessie accepted a research position with Yale Law School professor Ernest Lorenzen, an expert in comparative law and conflicts. In New Haven, Bessie impressed both Lorenzen and a wildly popular young faculty member by the name of William O. Douglas, the future Supreme Court Justice. With their help, Bessie overcame Dean Clark's earlier opposition and became the first woman ever awarded Yale's Sterling Fellowship for Graduate Studies. With her Yale doctorate, Bessie moved to Washington for a new opportunity. She applied for a job at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which Congress had just created to realize FDR's New Deal vision of supplying electricity to the Valley's impoverished residents. Bessie had strong ammunition to aid her hiring at TVA. As I uncovered here at the Library of Congress, as you can see on the slide, William O. Douglas lauded her brilliant academic record and recommended her to TVA as, quote, eminently qualified for a position of responsibility. But it may have been Professor Lorenzen who wrote what TVA apparently needed to hear to hire its first woman attorney, that Bessie was intent on a legal career, quote, as a primary objective from which she would not be deflected by consideration of marriage, end quote. Bessie thus began her federal government career with a pledge that she would be married to her job instead of a man. Fearing TVA's competition, private utility companies hurled charges of socialism that quickly turned into lawsuits. To defend this New Deal cornerstone, TVA hired James Lawrence Fly, a Harvard Law graduate and experienced trial lawyer from the Justice Department. Fly made Bessie a key member of his brilliant legal team. 2 landmark cases that established later the illegality of TVA's power program, Ashwander and later the Tennessee Electric Power Company, overshadowed all of TVA's work while Bessie was there. And Bessie researched, prepared witnesses, and materially shaped the briefs in both cases. In her other TVA work, she negotiated contracts and got courtroom experience in condemnation cases despite fierce resistance to a woman lawyer from local attorneys, judges, and even witnesses. How did she feel about her chosen profession? In 1938, Bessie shared her thoughts in the magazine published by her Alpha Epsilon Phi sorority. Law is still too greatly restricted for women, with considerable prejudice against them, she wrote, and offered this no-nonsense advice. A woman attorney must manage to be accepted and treated as another man, and must be willing to take responsibility, criticism, and hard work in the same spirit as do the men attorneys. She must aim to become one of the men without, however, becoming masculine or overly aggressive in her approach. Bessie practiced what she preached throughout her career. In March 1939, Bessie joined the Labor Department, where another New Deal program awaited enforcement. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 invoked federal commerce powers to prohibit child labor and to guarantee minimum wages and overtime. Bessie was there as every aspect of the new law was being tested. Her first week, she traveled home to New Orleans, where she won a motion to quash a subpoena. By year's end, she returned home to New Orleans more times on FLSA matters, including to deal with the Fifth Circuit's disposition of a Supreme Court-bound lawsuit that challenged the minimum wage for textile workers, then 32.5 cents an hour. The New Orleans press loved Bessie's local girl makes good story. One full-length photo, shown here, captured Bessie in a pose more cheesecake than lawyerly. Why wasn't she married, the press inquired. The reporter recounted Bessie's coy response this way: "I haven't had time for love." Then she smiled. "But I'm not immune. I'm just uncontaminated." Dr. Margolin brushed back a lock of soft black hair. "So far," she added. Now, Bessie's remark merits several notes. First, it was witty, like a line from a Katharine Hepburn movie, revealing Bessie's passion for wordsmithery. Second, she seemed neither defensive nor self-conscious about being single. And third, it just wasn't true. I'm going to digress to discuss a topic I'm invariably asked about, and that's Bessie's personal life. That it doesn't fit neatly within the contours of her career exemplifies the obstacles that an ambitious career woman faced of her time. During law school, Bessie was engaged to her classmate, the dashing Bob Butler. She broke it off in late 1933, surprising no one, except perhaps Bob. Little did Bob realize that his dream of marrying Bessie was doomed from the start. When he gave her a book inscribed "To My Sweetheart Bess," she inscribed the margins and blank pages of the same book, as you can see here, with extensive passages from Virginia Woolf's just published feminist essay, A Room of One's Own, extolling the importance of women having space, literally and figuratively. And then, perhaps you might have guessed, there was Larry Fly, Bessie's TVA boss, who was married with 2 children. Their love affair was a widespread secret. That's what colleagues, Fly's wife, and even Bessie told Fly's daughter, who was writing her father's never-finished biography. Remarkably, the romance did not impair Fly's supervision of TVA's lawyers, who consistently praised Fly for running one of the best law departments inside or out of government. Nor did any colleagues ever claim that Fly favored Margolin at TVA with assignments or promotions she didn't merit. The romance, however, had other consequences for Margolin and Fly, who was appointed chair of the Federal Communications Commission. In 1943, Georgia Congressman Eugene Cox commandeered a congressional committee to investigate the FCC, accusing Fly and the agency of, quote, Gestapo tactics to control the media and other un-American activities. Cox's investigators including one improbably named here as Bug-Eye, as you can see on the screen, scrutinized Fly's and Bessie's TVA travel vouchers to uncover honeymoon trips that they took together at government expense, and they interrogated Bessie's housekeepers, landlords, neighbors, and co-workers. But before Congressman Cox ever questioned Fly publicly about the affair, Congressmen Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson interceded. Rayburn reportedly told Cox, quote, "There ain't going to be no sex in this investigation. There's too damn many of us vulnerable on that score," end quote. Although Cox obliged, Bessie's romance with Fly kept resurfacing. In 1947, Bessie's membership in the National Lawyers Guild and some other liberal groups raised a red flag, so to speak, for the government's loyalty board, which referred the matter to the FBI. Although it uncovered no evidence of disloyalty, FBI's agents learned that Bessie had been Fly's mistress, which they dutifully recorded in her file. When Bessie's loyalty was again challenged in the 1950s, the charges were again dismissed, but only after the FBI revisited her file and her, quote, illicit love affair, end quote. The affair resurfaced one more time in the 1960s when now President Johnson was considering Bessie for a federal judgeship. Responding to a name check request, the FBI sent a memo to the White House summarizing all of its prior investigations, including Bessie's, quote, illicit love affair, end quote, from 2 decades earlier. There are at least 3 lessons Bessie should have learned from her romance with Fly. Don't get involved with a direct report, be very discreet, and don't get involved with a married man. Well, Bessie heeded 2 of these 3 lessons when she fell in love with Bob Genane, the well-respected general counsel to the Interstate Commerce Commission. He was not her direct report, although he was a professional colleague who argued a dozen more times at the Supreme Court than she did, and she was very discreet. Friends and family were stunned when Bessie announced in 1981, after Bob's wife died, that they planned to marry. Stunned not only because Bessie and Bob were both in their 70s and everyone figured Bessie would never marry, but mostly because no one knew anything about the relationship which had started 2 decades earlier. Sadly, Bob died in 1984 before he and Bessie ever realized their public life together. The drama of Bessie's personal life never impeded her work. In her early years at the Labor Department, she paid her dues reviewing timesheets in damp warehouses and traveling back roads to interview vegetable packers and log cutters. She organized the labor solicitors' regional offices and trained the regional attorneys. She began arguing and winning appeals in the federal circuit courts and started working with the Solicitor General's office on cases headed for the Supreme Court. Bessie's high-quality work earned her recognition. Solicitor General Charles Fahey was delighted with the Supreme Court brief she principally wrote and her help preparing him for his successful Supreme Court argument. When he learned that Bessie had already argued in every federal circuit, he promised she could argue the next Fair Labor Standards Act case to go to the Supreme Court. In March 1945, as only the 25th woman ever to argue at the Supreme Court, Margolin argued Phillips v. Walling, seeking to affirm the First Circuit's decision that the Act's retail establishment exemption did not operate to remove warehouse employees of an interstate grocery store chain from the FLSA's protections. After what must have been a lively argument, Justice Robert Jackson marked the occasion with a thoughtful note, the first of several he wrote to Bessie over the years. "I hope you were satisfied with the way the court argued your first case. In any event, you have every reason to feel satisfied with the way you took care of yourself under fire. I'm sure there would be no dissent from the opinion that you should argue here often." Bessie won the case, establishing that Fair Labor Standards Act exemptions must be narrowly construed. In 1945 alone, Bessie argued 4 more cases at the Supreme Court and prevailed in 3. These and the rest that followed advanced the Act's humanitarian purposes by extending coverage and restricting exemptions to protect wage earners to the full extent Congress intended, and by securing the department's enforcement tools, such as injunctions by which to obtain back pay. When Bessie presented her 4th and 5th Supreme Court arguments, Justice Jackson was not on the bench. He was in Nuremberg, serving as the U.S. Chief Prosecutor for Nazi war crimes. This new and exciting legal pursuit attracted Bessie, who in May 1946 went to Nuremberg to help organize the American military tribunals for the subsequent proceedings. For her 6-month tour of duty, the Army's commanding officer acknowledged Bessie's primary role in drafting the rules that govern the remainder of the war crimes trials of nearly 200 second-tier Nazis, including the judges, the doctors, and the industrialists. One of the great examples of the wonderful needles about Bessie's life that I found here in the archival haystacks at the Library of Congress are pictured here, including photographs in which, on the left, we can see Bessie, wearing glasses, in the gallery, listening to Justice Jackson's historic closing argument to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. And on the right, a few days later, attending Jackson's celebratory dinner. In December 1946, Bessie returned to the Labor Department to resume her work as assistant solicitor. She epitomized a new post-war ideal of glamour, of a glamorous career girl succeeding in a man's world of law, as depicted here when she was featured in the January 1948 issue of Glamour, then known as the magazine for a girl with a job. But glamour did not interfere with grit. By the time she retired in 1972, Margolin had directed the preparation and review of approximately 600 Supreme Court briefs and appellate briefs on the merits, with an additional 150 or so petitions and oppositions to petitions for Supreme Court review. But most impressively, Margolin principally briefed and personally argued 177 cases in both the Supreme Court and the appellate courts. Of the 150 circuit court cases she argued, she obtained favorable rulings in 114 out of 150, only one of which the Supreme Court later reversed, and it was argued by someone other than Bessie Margolin. Of the 36 cases she lost in the circuit courts, the Supreme Court later reversed 7, 6 of which she argued. Bessie Margolin was no great orator, but she engaged the justices who respected her meticulous preparation and her encyclopedic knowledge of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And she was able to employ humor, something not often done with success at the Supreme Court. In this 1955 audio clip, you'll hear Bessie spar with Justice Felix Frankfurter in Steiner v. Mitchell, where Bessie successfully argued that battery plant workers whose jobs required them to come into contact with toxic chemicals had a right to wages for the time they spent changing their clothes and showering, an issue that has been revived recently at the court. Although you may not be able to make out what he's saying, you'll hear Justice Frankfurter's annoyance with Congress for imposing on the courts what he considered to be undue burdens of interpretation, an annoyance he frequently redirected at Bessie.
Now, I grant you that that is not something that's ABC, a simple decision to make, but it's no different than many questions of statutory interpretation as to the application of the legal criterion of the statute.
And it would not have been too difficult to put your word into the statute.
What, work day and whistle to whistle?
No, just what you said.
Well,
That's what you said.
when you try to get 400, you've many times said to me that the court should, these are questions for Congress and not for the court. But after all, Congress has 400 or 500 people that they have to get into agreement on language. And the court has just 9. And which is enough.
In fact, what they don't do to us, we call it the advantage of Congress.
Well, I'm sure, Mr. Justice Frankfurter, I don't need to tell you that language is not something that is easy to make clear.
And in this next 1960 clip, you'll hear how comfortable she was with the justices who were probing her positions and dissecting her arguments. Here you'll have her, she was just plain having fun with the way Justice Charles Whittaker worded one of his questions.
This offers an opportunity to straighten out the court, and I would like to go on to show the other clear basic areas.
Just a minute, please. May I ask just this question? Do you stand or fall in this case on your answer to the Chief Justice?
What do you mean, do I stand? As I see it,
You stand.
I stand, I don't fall on either. I stand.
Bessie won that case 8-1 with, guess who, Justice Whittaker providing the lone dissent. As for Justice Frankfurter, despite the banter you heard in the previous clip, Bessie and he enjoyed a cordial relationship outside the courtroom. Frankfurter inscribed a copy of his book, Of Law and Men, to her this way: "For Bessie Margolin, who pleases me more often than I, through no fault of mine, please her." She certainly got his attention, as evidenced by Frankfurter's notes from the bench. In one, Frankfurter referred to Bessie's, quote, deft use of her feminine charms, end quote, and in another to her exploitation of her female talents. I guess you could say she was accused of playing the woman's card quite a few years ago. In the early 1960s, the audacious Bessie Margolin decided to pursue a federal judgeship, a campaign she waged for much of the decade. And not just any judgeship. She wanted a seat on either the D.C. Federal Circuit Court or the Court of Claims. With enthusiastic supporters from Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Labor Department, Bessie's name was considered by LBJ himself. It's not clear what, if any, role her affair with Fly played in the decision, but she faced other hurdles. One male White House staffer criticized her fashion-forward appearance as, quote, flamboyant, and another opined, quote, that her age, 58, would tend to preclude her from consideration, end quote. By 1968, Bessie had been passed over for 7 federal judicial vacancies on those 2 courts alone, all filled by men, 4 older than she. The silver lining from Bessie not getting the judgeship, at least for us, is that she remained at the Labor Department. Promoted in 1963 to associate solicitor, Bessie developed the strategies and personally argued the first appeals under the Equal Pay Act and, with some ironic humor, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. By the time she retired in 1972, Bessie oversaw the filing of 300 Equal Pay Act lawsuits in 40 states, ultimately recovering $4 million for nearly 18,000 employees and earning the title of the nation's #1 fighter for equal pay for women. Bessie understood that equal pay was only one part of a bigger blueprint for equal employment opportunities. In more than a dozen speeches to labor lawyers and corporate counsel, almost always men, she used her authoritative voice as a veteran of Fair Labor Standards Act courtroom battles to explain the Equal Pay Act and the related sex discrimination provision in Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One such battle was Schultz v. Wheaton Glass Company, perhaps Margolin's most significant appellate victory that was never heard by the Supreme Court, which one commentator likened to a second Brown v. Board of Education. The New Jersey trial court had ruled that so-called male selector packers in the glass factory were entitled to 10% higher pay than the female selector packers, largely because the men possessed, quote, greater flexibility to perform additional duties, end quote. A decision, despite its merits, that was feared reversal proof because of the judge's extensive factual recitations informed by his 2 visits to the factory, when even a single visit from a judge to a place during a lawsuit is rare. Yet Margolin convinced the Third Circuit Court of Appeals to reverse the trial court's decision and to establish that jobs need only be substantially equal and not identical to merit equal pay under the Act. The company petitioned the Supreme Court for review, also known as cert, shorthand for certiorari. At Bessie's gala retirement dinner in 1972, former labor solicitor Lawrence Silberman, today a senior federal circuit court judge for the D.C. Circuit, described what happened next.
As I told you, the Third Circuit, after argument, was terrorized into a decision which was, to say the least, sweeping in scope. I distinctly saw a footnote between the lines saying, "We'll give you anything you want. Please don't send her down again." And counsel for the other side petitioned for certiorari. And Bessie and I discussed it. Now, you could see the light in Bessie's eyes. She had a sweeping decision in the Third Circuit, but here was an opportunity to take an equal pay case to the Supreme Court. And Bessie suggested that maybe we should not oppose cert, because it would be appropriate to have the Supreme Court see this issue. Well, I didn't think there was anywhere in the world we were ever going to get a decision that was better than that Third Circuit decision. And I was by no means sure that the Supreme Court was going to be as terrorized as the Third Circuit. Although there are other speakers, there's another speaker this evening that can address that point. But I figured a way to deal with the problem. I just sort of leaned back in my chair and I said, "Bessie, you know, I've never argued a case in the Supreme Court." She said, "We'll oppose cert."
That was just one of the stories that Judge Silberman shared with Margolin's more than 200 guests. Chief Justice Earl Warren then retired, before whom Bessie had argued more than half of her Supreme Court cases was guest speaker. And among his papers here, I found a folder with correspondence and his handwritten notes about the dinner. Here's an excerpt, an audio excerpt, of Chief Justice Warren's stirring tribute to Margolin.
That in the 33 years of litigation representing the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Labor Department, and implementing the Fair Labor Standards Act, she didn't always have a bed of roses. I am sure the hundreds of briefs that she wrote and the scores of cases she argued, some in every one of the 11 circuits and 27 in the Supreme Court, must have raised enough hackles in some quarters to have made her look forward to the serenity of retirement. The 27 cases alone that she argued in the Supreme Court was a prodigious undertaking. The Fair Labor Standards Act was not always popular in all quarters, and the flesh and sinews that were developed around its bare bones were her great contribution to millions of American working people. Many of these people do not know who Bessie Margolin is or what a great service she rendered to them. But if they did know, they would praise her tonight. In their name, I would like to thank her tonight, because the bare bones of that act would have been wholly inadequate without the implementation that she gave in the courtroom, she forged in the courtroom of our land.
It's hard to top the Chief Justice's remarks about Bessie Margolin, so I'll offer only one concluding comment. Fair labor lawyer, the title of Margolin's biography refers literally to the New Deal legislation that she shepherded through the federal courts. But it also refers to the fairness of Margolin's own career, the obstacles she faced as a woman, the opportunities that influential supporters afforded her, her use of her feminine charms, and her nonconformist personal life. For me, the title also represents the challenges I've imposed on myself to restore Bessie Margolin's rightful place in history and to do justice in telling her remarkable story. I hope I've succeeded. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about Bessie or my research here at the Library of Congress. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions.
If you just repeat the question.
I will do that. Yes.
This is absolutely fascinating. I do have a kind of a personal connection.
The audience said this was absolutely fascinating. I want to get that on my, thank you.
I worked for some utilities that sued the Tennessee Valley Authority and won, but be that as it may. You didn't say anything about your own personal relationship with her. What was it? How did you get to know her? What did you know about her? Tell me about your friendship with her.
Our connection, which I only briefly alluded to, really was through this Southern Jewish Welfare Agency. Margolin lived, as you saw, in the orphanage that stood and operated until 1946. I was orphaned at age 11, and although the orphanage was closed, the agency continued on and continues to this day as a social service agency and oversaw my foster care. The wonderful legacy of the orphanage, the Isidore Newman School, now and then and now a prestigious prep school, honored its founding charter to admit me as a modern orphan who otherwise would have gone there as of right. When I came to Goucher, the letter you saw from my guidance counselor really was that she thought that Bessie Margolin and I would enjoy meeting each other, certainly more so on my part. And we did. And it was in those meetings, me as a terribly timid and know-nothing college freshman, and this worldly, dignified, wonderful, brilliant woman would just in conversation talk about her career and people she knew, and I only wish I had a tape recorder for everything that she said. So over those years, it really, friendship, mentorship, just sort of a kinship, and she was very generous and very kind to me. Less in terms of, she did in fact write my bar reference letters when I first applied to the Maryland and DC bars, and I was thrilled to find little bits of myself in her papers when they came into my possession. So that was our relationship, and everything I knew about her, I sort of held back to review the evidence I gathered from her papers, from the needles I found in archival haystacks of other people, but used it to fill in or to confirm or to second guess. But I had to make sure this would not be hagiography or simply my own and perhaps innocent or naive understanding of a woman whose life was far bigger than anything I could have known. The only postscript is I needed, as part of my work in the Attorney General's office in 1993, to file papers with the Supreme Court. We know how rare it is for cases to actually be taken for review, but these were oppositions to petitions for review. And since I wanted to sign my name, I needed to be officially admitted to the Supreme Court. Bessie Margolin and I had fallen out of touch probably for 8 or so years by then, but I reached out to her to learn only that she was infirm and in a nursing home at that time. I was admitted on someone else's motion, but just sort of the link in great history that the day I was admitted to the Supreme Court bar in October 1993 was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's first day on the bench. And there was just some wonderful symmetry, although it was bittersweet because to have Bessie Margolin move that admission would have been extraordinary. Yes?
Let me ask you something. First, I honestly never heard of the lady before.
You are not alone.
So it's quite interesting to hear her story. I'm also a lawyer. I didn't study in America, but I studied in the Netherlands, right? A few questions that your talk forces me to ask. Obviously, she faced
the tremendous backlash against the New Deal legislation that, that we know that was organized by corporate America, and that basically continues at this point in time with tremendous success at this point in time. But did she ever comment about the fact that even the labor law at its most developed, right, was very limited. Blacks were excluded.
Yes.
Obviously, people working in agriculture, I believe, were excluded. There were tremendous exclusions to this act. Did she ever consider the need to update this law, the need to push this law much further, the need to radicalize this law?
Right.
Create much more
The question I was asked
distribution of wealth and income?
was whether, I'm going to repeat this, and we'll take them one at a time. The question asked was whether Bessie Margolin ever instigated change in the Fair Labor Standards Act to make it more inclusive, to fill in the exceptions and the coverage. Dealing with any new law, getting it passed in the first place is an extraordinary accomplishment, and it was well received, of course, by those most directly affected. What I do recall Bessie saying, and it was in a newspaper report, she was asked something about how her personal feelings about the Fair Labor Standards Act, and mind you, she was coming from the TVA, where employees who were liberally minded were accused of communism and declared as radicals. And so her response has to be taken in the context of a very young attorney who wanted to move forward in that. Her response was, I'm right with this, the Fair Labor Standards Act. I'm a New Dealer, and I'm no radical, but I'm right with it. I'm a New Dealer. And throughout her life, the values of social justice, which I only touched on briefly, which were part of the way she was reared in this Jewish orphanage, come through in terms of why she sought out opportunities. Obviously, she would not have had a place in a Wall Street law firm, but she particularly endeared herself to the mission. She did not handle legislation. She might have been consulted, but it was not her role. There are many lawyers who work in the enforcement of laws who are not particularly involved in its enhancement or amendment. And I'll take one more.
The next question would be, obviously, during her lifetime, especially at the end of her lifetime, even during my time in law school in the Netherlands and University of Utrecht in the 1980s, right, is when all type of feminist notions started to come into the law, right? Did she ever, you talk about Justice Ginsburg, right? Her role in that process. Did she ever, later on in her life, right? Obviously she retired, you said 1972, you said, right? So she's a little bit before that time, but certainly the 1960s were pushing directly into that direction, right? Did she ever later on comment on, or had anything to say, given her experiences, obviously the discriminatory and the sexist problems that she had to deal with in her career? Did she ever later on write about, talked about, discuss the notions of the feminist notions that were starting to be developed?
Yes. Well, she was at the center of it. She was responsible for the Labor Department's enforcement of the brand new Equal Pay Act. The first time since suffrage had a federal law been passed for the equality of women. And it was at that time, when asked, she revealed what she would claim was her reluctant feminism. She told a reporter, I've never been a feminist, which was not true. She fought all her life for equal status of women, but just not in a global way. She said, but now that I'm seeing in my work enforcing the Equal Pay Act the discrimination and suffering faced by so many women, I'm becoming one. And I also didn't mention, Bessie was a founding member of the National Organization for Women and was at the founding meeting in October 1966. When I listened to the tapes, the audio tapes that are archived at the Schlesinger Archives at Harvard, When she entered the room, she was met by applause from the women who were gathered that morning in the basement of the Washington Post for this historic assemblage. So yes, she was very much all her life a feminist, even though taking on that term was something that was very difficult for many women, and was very proud of it and became part of her public persona when she went around the country, in addition to litigation, trying to change corporate culture's ideas. She was met with ridicule. She was often asked to speak at bar meetings where jokes were being told about women in the workplace. And Bessie, rather than taking offense and not showing up, would maintain her cool, and she would talk about the fact that the law and status of equality had not yet reached a time where humor could be taken lightly, certainly not by a representative of the Labor Department. But she went on to tell people, and it was said of her that her coming to many of these events was met with, the force of God having her come so that people would listen, knowing she prevailed in so many cases under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Did they really want to take their chances now with the Equal Pay Act? Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
In looking at the credits, I see Millville Public Library. I understand all of the others. Why Millville, and is there an extant collection of Bessie Margolin?
No, not at all. There's no extensive collection on Bessie Margolin anywhere except now at Tulane, where I've personally created a finding aid for the papers that her family donated. Millville, New Jersey is the site of the Wheaton Glass Company, and I went there because they have on microfilm newspapers that are not even available in the Library of Congress, the Millville Daily, and I wanted local color about what it was like for the women in the Millville plant who were taking on what was a family-run dynasty in Millville, New Jersey. I found very little except and this, I guess, is my last anecdote, a gentleman, and this is the wonders of librarians who can show you things you can't ever find. When I explained what I was doing there, the librarian came and relieved me from looking at reels of microfilm. And she said, you know, there's a gentleman here today. He volunteers as a tutor. He tells me he worked as a summer intern at the Wheaton Glass Factory, and he'd be happy to talk with you. Went down and talked with him. He was a college student who worked there over the summer, and you never know what you expect to hear. He immediately confirmed that the women did precisely what the men did, and in fact, he always tried to stand next to the women on the conveyor belts because he found that they protected him. That is, it was like an I Love Lucy show. The bottles came out of the oven, they cooled, and they had to be inspected and packed into cartons to the immediate side of the belt, and the belt did not stop. And this young man was so pleased because the women always watched out for him, his words, and pulled him from having bottles broken. He also said that the occasional things that the men did that the judge claimed was the flexibility was that they would occasionally bend down and lift boxes and move them, but he said what the women did in varying degrees of work far equaled, if not exceeded, the value of what was happening. So, always a librarian to the rescue. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Marlene. It was a wonderful talk, and the work you are doing is very much in Bessie's tradition, and what you've chosen to do, I think, is not only worthwhile, but important, and your demonstration of the spirit of Bessie and that it still lives. So we really appreciate you being here, and appreciate the little plug or two for the Library of Congress and other libraries, including small public libraries. That's a wonderful story at the end. We're now going to have a book signing, and you'll have a chance to speak more with Marlene about her book and her own experiences. Please buy a copy outside and take advantage of having the author signing. One more time, a round of applause for Marlene. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.